Boys for a short while. While working for the Stanleys, he developed a real passion for the broadcasting end of it. He joined the Stanley, and they were live on radio almost every day. And so Dad had a couple of purposes in seeking a radio career. Sorry, folks. Had a
Yeah.
up there.
Well, we'll get into all of that, Joe. It's like I know one of the things I know about Joe is he is a, and I mean this in the very best way. He is a great talker. He's got that radio manner, and you just get him started on a topic he knows about, and it's just fascinating to listen to. But I want to build you up and give you the introduction. Joe is he has a band, the Radio Ramblers, that has received more awards than I can even think of. At some point I decided I wasn't even going to try to write it down and say all of what that was. Did you also get IBMA Song of the Year this past year?
Well, we got Song of the Year in 18. We got Entertainers of the Year last year.
Entertainers of the Year. That was it. Okay. A whole bunch of times he's a radio broadcaster. He's also been the IBMA, for those of you who don't know, is the International Bluegrass Music Association, which is the professional organization for bluegrass music. He's been IBMA Broadcaster of the Year more than once.
Well, just once.
That's still a pretty big deal. And he owns a bunch of radio stations which broadcast under the name Real Roots Radio out in Ohio. As he started saying, his dad, who passed away, it was 2008, was it?
12 years ago.
12 years ago, was a fiddle player, and he played in his father's band, Paul Mullins and the Traditional Grass, for many years, and his father had played with the Stanley Brothers, and I believe wrote a song that they recorded, or at least one, right? I was just looking him up in the Gary Reed book, The Music of the Stanley Brothers, and
yeah, his part was very short. His time with them was very short, but after he left the Stanleys, he was popular on radio in Eastern Kentucky, and he was the first bluegrasser to record "Come Down the Mountain" Katie Daly.
Right.
Katie Daly's been a great standard now for years. Dad's record was in '62. Ralph did it in '71, and then a dozen others since then.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say for our students here, I know some of you are new to bluegrass. Some of you are just eavesdropping in here, and we're really in Augusta for one of the other styles of music. So if there's something you hear us mention that you don't understand, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'm glad to clear it out. And I'll just be saying, Joe, along those lines, I may, as we're discussing things, I may give what sounds to us as bluegrass people like too much information, just on the chance that it might help somebody understand what we're going on, like the Stanley Brothers. Well, if we had Mount Rushmore for bluegrass, Bill Monroe would be on it, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs would be on it, and Ralph and Carter Stanley would be on it. And if you've hung around bluegrass for any length of time, hung around in jam sessions, you have heard Carter Stanley's songs. They are part of the foundation of the whole style. So that may be all we need to say about that, but I'm just saying this is royalty in the bluegrass world, the Stanley Brothers. So we had a similar discussion a few years ago, and we had Danny Paisley as our guest master artist. And it's a similar kind of thing. He grew up in this regional bluegrass scene in a family where his father was, how should we put it, the real thing. And I say that as somebody who is, look, I'm the grandchild of immigrants, and I grew up in New York City, and I did not grow up with bluegrass. I took to it as a teenager because I just heard it and I loved it. But I'm always aware that that's not the music I grew up with. I'm kind of come to it as an outsider, and I'm always interested to hear the perspective of people who really came up through the culture that produced bluegrass. And your dad, I believe, was originally from Kentucky. And when did he move to Ohio? Because that's where you were born, right?
Yeah. Dad was from extreme poverty in Eastern Kentucky. His way out was the military in the mid-'50s, and that's where he learned fiddle. He had played regionally on radio some, playing guitar and singing as a teenage kid before he left Kentucky. But he developed a radio career starting in 1960 in eastern Kentucky, and left Kentucky for Middletown, Ohio in 1964. I was born in Middletown, Ohio in 1965. And Middletown, Ohio's got a rich bluegrass history. Middletown is right between Dayton and Cincinnati, Ohio.
Ah, okay.
And our region is just, matter of fact, we've got a book and a CD on the way called Industrial Strength Bluegrass, Ohio's Musical Legacy. And because we're talking about a place where the Osborne brothers started, and so did Larry Sparks, a place where Jimmy Martin and Jim and Jesse both spent time, Red Allen, right on up to the Dry Branch Fire Squad and my band and dozens of others, Earl Taylor and Jim McCall. All the recordings that were made in Cincinnati and Dayton are legendary. Ricky Skaggs and Keith Whitley's first recordings were made in Dayton. Flatt and Scruggs recorded Foggy Mountain Breakdown in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
So my dad migrated just as there was a huge Appalachian migration for folks after World War II looking for work in the factories in Cincinnati and Dayton and surrounding environs. My dad moved to Middletown, Ohio from eastern Kentucky for better work as a broadcaster. And the radio station in Middletown was kind of an anchor, an early country music radio station. First place where the Osborne brothers sang and performed, and a place where Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell performed during their heyday. He came there in '64 and hit just exactly at the right time in the right place to include not only his favorite music, but his culture for the large metropolitan audiences in Dayton and Cincinnati and in the region. So it was a great place for me to grow up. It was just a bluegrass mecca in the late '60s and through the '70s and '80s when I was growing up.
So that's kind of interesting to me. First of all, what you're saying is very similar to what Danny Paisley told us, except that his family came up and ended up to the east of the Appalachians in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware, and your family goes to the west side, but it's still the same idea of people trying to escape poverty, going where the jobs were. What I thought was really interesting, though, is there, we often think of Kentucky and that region as that's where the old time music is. That's where people grow up playing music. And your dad apparently did not grow up playing music. You said it wasn't until he was in the Army. So that's kind of going against what I would have expected.
Well, no, I don't want to mislead you, Ira. He was very interested in music as a youngster in eastern Kentucky. He didn't become a fiddler until he was in the Army in the mid-'50s. But he had a great story he told about seeing Flatt and Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys in 1952. He would have been 15 or 16 years old. And he saw the Foggy Mountain Boys live on the stage live on the front steps of the courthouse in Frenchburg, Kentucky, where he was in high school. And he said from then on, he was hooked so deep. That's what he wanted to do, was learn how to play the fiddle, to perform, and present bluegrass music. He came to be a professional broadcaster at a time when there wasn't segregation among bluegrass and country music. In 1960, when he started on radio full time, you heard the Stanley Brothers and Reno and Smiley and Flatt and Scruggs right alongside Fair and Young and Jim Reeves and Marty Robbins. And he maintained that style of broadcasting for 45 years. He played what he liked among current traditional country artists who had hits. He was very selective. If it had, a whole lot of strings or horns or something that was a little bit too polished, if it was overwhelmed the Nashville sound, he didn't like that a lot. He liked Loretta Lynn and Ernest Tubb and Connie Smith and Hank Snow and Hank Williams and Waylon and Willie and stuff that had some guts. And he played traditional country music and bluegrass music simultaneously in full-time commercial radio. That makes a difference too, because he was a great radio pitch man. So he was popular with advertisers. He sold every type of vehicle and insurance policy and furniture and shoes and hardware on the radio. And so being a commercial commodity, it gave a lot of credibility to the kind of music he liked.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to recognize. I mean, it's been several decades now that we've been seeing bluegrass as this kind of world of its own, and to some extent it's developed that way. But really, it is part of country music. And another thing that I think we were discussing this earlier this afternoon in the bluegrass and old time discussion, that it's bluegrass from the very start was commercial country music. It was not people playing on their back porch. It was people taking the stuff they played on their back porch and polishing it up into a commercial product. And something we'll get into in a little bit. I don't want to start with it right now, but from the very beginning, radio was a part of that. But I would like to ask you, though, about your musical history personally. How did you start learning to play music? Was it something your father made an effort to show you, or did you just absorb it, or who were your influences?
I had constant exposure from birth, hearing him on radio daily, seeing him on stages with great musicians, or hearing him on records with great bands from the time I can remember. And but I think I was 3 or 4 years old at Christmas time in the 60s, and got a little half-size harmony guitar and got a record player for Christmas. And that started, I was hooked. And I learned to play rhythm guitar as a very little kid. I learned to play rhythm guitar behind some of Dad's fiddle tunes, how to keep time. Learned how to play a few basic Carter family songs and sing along with the guitar as a youngster. Again, there was always great musicians throughout the household. Dad was always promoting somebody's concert on the radio or working with a band that had to come to the house and rehearse. And so I got to see a lot of great banjo players as a youngster. Dad had bought a banjo one winter off some guy needing some money, and it was at the house. And I think I was 12 or 13 when I picked it up and started fooling with it. I had seen, again, great banjo players. Dad could play a little bit. He learned to play some when he worked for the Stanley Brothers.
Really,
And,
like three finger style?
Three-finger style banjo. He could play a few basic tunes. And when I started fooling with it, it came real natural. And he said, learn to concentrate on playing a good solid forward roll. And he said, dig into everything Scruggs recorded in his early years and start with that and pay attention to the basics. And I did. And it took to it real naturally because I had heard that since I was a kid. And I had some players I could go to if I got stuck, or if Dad heard me struggling with something. At least a half a dozen times a year, I got to be with J.D. Crowe or Sonny Osborne or Ralph Stanley. And locally, Noah Crace was a great banjo player that had worked for Monroe in the 50s and recorded a lot of stuff with Dad in the 60s and with the boys from Indiana in the 70s. And I'd seen him regularly since I was a kid. And so I knew what great bluegrass banjo was supposed to sound like. And the time I was about 14, man, I was locked in front of a record player with everything by Flatt and Scruggs. Even had a collection of 78s I could slow down to 45, try to figure out the roll Earl was using on all the great classics.
Cool. Hey Joe, I'm T, your Augusta host. I wanted to jump in because we have a question in the chat feed here from Jeff Harris. He was wondering if your dad lived in Grafton, West Virginia.
No, we never were West Virginia residents. Dad was from Menifee County, Kentucky. Lived in Florida for a while with the Stanley Brothers in the late 50s. And then it was Eastern Kentucky all the way on a couple different radio stations, and then to Middletown, Ohio, until he passed away.
And I have a personal question. I was wondering if you or your dad played often for dances, or if dancing was part of any of the kind of the broadcast jamborees you might have been a part of over the radio or your local community.
No, it was rare. Every now and then we might play a certain venue where there was a good collection of old-time dancers or tap dancers, and they wanted to hear a fiddle tune, and Dad could certainly oblige. He could play those old standard fiddle tunes all day long and let folks dance. Even played some shows when I was young up in Eastern Kentucky when they'd have a cakewalk. It's just kind of a lot of old-time influences there. But we didn't play square dance music regularly. By the time I started playing professionally in the 80s, most of the time, if you had a regional square dance club, they played to recordings and had a caller.
Right.
You go to the square dance thing, you know, before recorded music, you had Monroe playing with his Uncle Pen. Um, you had in the 30s and 40s, before there was a variety of recorded music, you had live hillbilly music playing for square dances, but not by the time I came along.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking about picking up things from all of these great banjo players who passed through. Were these people who kind of stayed with your dad when they were passing through the area, or
Yeah,
just
sometimes. Or Dad would fill in. He played a lot of shows with Charlie Moore and Bill Napier, with the Goins brothers, with the Osborne brothers. He was lifelong friends with Bobby and Sonny both. We came to Ohio about the time they joined the Opry and moved to Nashville, but they had a wonderful friendship. He would sit in on fiddle with them often, even helped Ralph Stanley when he didn't have anybody. And often my mother loved to cook, and they just were full of hospitality. So I would see the Osborne brothers or the Country Gentlemen or Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys or Jimmy Martin in our living room when I was growing up. And by the time I started getting serious about learning banjo, I knew J.D. Crowe and Cy Osborne and Ralph Stanley and Don Reno on a first name basis. And so if Dad was the master of ceremonies at a great bluegrass concert or festival in the area, or if he was playing with another act and I got to tag along at 14, 15, 16 years old, I'd often be blessed to have an hour or two with some of those guys to straighten out what I was trying to learn on my own. They were very, very generous with their time.
Yeah. So who would you say were kind of your big influences on banjo? I will say I think I detect a little bit of Sonny Osborne influence, or maybe even more than a little bit. One thing I remember seeing you at Delaware Valley in the mid '90s, you did something in the key of F, and you got to the 4 chord, which is B flat chord for you folks playing out in your living rooms. And you did this really neat chord voice when you got that low open D, as well as some fretted stuff. Not anything I would have ever thought to do, but I kind of thing I could see Sonny doing.
Sonny was a great influence. By the time I got really serious about playing banjo in the late 70s, the Osborne brothers were the top act of the time. Flatt and Scruggs, while we were all bluegrass banjo are influenced by the great recordings of Scruggs. You didn't see Scruggs at bluegrass festivals in the 70s and 80s, but the Osborne brothers hit the stage with their identifiable sound, and there they were, bigger than life for a guy like me. And so I was surrounded with their recordings. Sonny and J.D. Were both family friends and both extremely influential to me and generous with their time. I got to see both of those guys on stage continuously in the 70s and 80s. And seeing those two guys live and getting to spend a little time with each of them, watch them play up close and personal, had a lot to do with it. And Ralph Stanley, too. Ralph was a family friend from day one. Got to see Ralph play. Quite a few distinct differences in Ralph's style and tone and that of Sonny Osborne. I was blessed at a very young age to help my dad start the band, the Traditional Grass. That would have been about December of '83. We started playing regionally. And by '85, '86, '87, we were playing a lot because Dad and I were both on radio at a station that had a huge reach. And we programmed bluegrass and country music commercially and had a great following in my young years. And that was a very good vocal band. So I'll go back to Sonny Osborne. Sonny Osborne was the greatest at playing commercial country music on a 5-string banjo, at taking great new songs, and his brother is the greatest vocalist ever in bluegrass. You take the Osborne brothers arranging phenomenal songs, and Sonny could play anything the song called for in the way of backup, intros, endings, fills. His banjo style appealed to me more than anything once I started singing a lot. I learned how to sing alongside Mark Rader, who was a great guitar man and songwriter with the band The Traditional Grass. So as I evolved as a young artist in my own right, by 1990-91, man, we were working 100+ shows a year, and we were developing a great vocal style. And Sonny Osborne's banjo work, him and Crowe and Bill Emerson all, and they're made to play with a great vocal arrangement. And so I was really into that.
Yeah, and as a singer, even though we in our music we have Don Reno and Ralph Stanley as examples, we really don't have a lot of banjo players who are singing tenor. And you're kind of an exception to that. How did you learn to do harmony singing? Because that's something that I think a lot of students, I won't say struggle with, but it takes them a while to get the hang of it, to understand what it's about.
Yeah.
Did you actually work on that, or did you just absorb it?
I really absorbed it. Dad wasn't a great singer. He sang some lead and some tenor in different configurations with bands that he recorded with in the 60s and 70s. But again, I go back to the early 80s. I hooked up with guitar player Mark Rader. Mark's still a great friend. We've been very close for almost 40 years now. Mark was a naturally gifted singer. We started the band, The Traditional Grass, and 90% of what we accomplished the first few years when I was just 19, 20, 21 years old was duets. And I had learned to sing a little tenor as a teenage kid, doing stuff with my dad. If we had visitors at the house, we wanted to play a little music, or occasionally Dad would be in charge of the stage at Bean Blossom, Indiana, or at some other major bluegrass event. If somebody needed a half-hour set, me and Dad would whip out a half hour's worth of duets. So I really started developing my tenor voice working alongside Mark Rader as a guy, 19, 20, 21 years old. That band evolved, wound up with a recording contract with Rebel Records. And from like 91 to 95, we cranked out 4 albums, about half rare covers and about half original music. And we wound up with another great part singer in the band in the late Gerald Evans Jr. We really concentrated a lot on our vocal sound. We had a great trio there for quite a while.
Sure did.
So in all those years of watching Sonny Osborne and J.D. Crowe on stage and Ralph Stanley, I don't play a lot while I'm singing. That's been the rare Jim that could do that. Ralph could play and sing at the same time. Dave Evans could play and sing at the same time. The late Mike Lilly from my area here in Dayton, Ohio, could play and sing at the same time. But I go to the J.D. and Sonny school. They were great harmony vocalists, and as soon as they pronounced the last syllable of any part they were singing, they had something clever to play to fill up the music on banjo.
And you can see Scruggs doing that too. You guys out there who are banjo players, listen to Flatt and Scruggs recordings. When they have trio vocals, you don't hear any banjo on the chorus. Maybe a little bit of chopping between the lines, because Earl is stopping playing and concentrating on his singing, and then he throws in that lick right at the end, and at the end of the chorus. I feel for all that I've read and learned a lot about bluegrass history, I really don't feel I know enough about Ohio bluegrass, because I know that has for decades been a really vibrant bluegrass scene, and I know some of the people involved. You mentioned a bunch of them earlier, but can you identify any kind of particular characteristics of it that would distinguish it from, say, Washington, D.C. bluegrass or San Francisco bluegrass, or any other scene? What is it about the Ohio thing that makes it so distinctive?
I don't know. There's a book coming out. I've worked alongside Fred Bartenstein and Curtis Ellison from Miami University. Miami brought together several bluegrass scholars here in my neighborhood, including me, about 5 years ago, to start archiving and documenting everything relative to the history of bluegrass music in southwestern Ohio, the Dayton and Cincinnati region of Ohio particularly. And we did a series of lectures and a beautiful traveling display that we all curated at Miami University a few years ago. That series of lectures has been edited to a book that will be available in January from University of Chicago, Illinois Press, called Industrial Strength Bluegrass, Southwestern Ohio's Musical Legacy. And simultaneously, while the book is in production right now, I'm working as a record producer, and I'm finding songs from that connect to our region of Ohio, and we're recording current bluegrass and roots artists doing songs that connect to my neighborhood. And early in our conversation, Ira, you referenced how the radio business was such a huge part of early country music, which included bluegrass and hillbilly music. And, you know, from the Monroe Brothers to Bill and the Bluegrass Boys to Flatt and Scruggs to Mac Wiseman, Stanley Brothers, every successful early country music or bluegrass music act, they had to be attached to a radio station. They would be attached to a radio station for a year or two sometimes, play an area out, move on to another radio station.
And just to clarify for people, when he says play an area out, they would use that, they would have probably a daily program, usually a daily program on the station, and they would play songs and, you know, get mail-in requests. And they would advertise their shows in the area. And, you know, they would play at, you know, community centers and schoolhouses and all that, all around within the range of the radio station signal. And after about a year or so, it kind of lost its novelty for the people in the area, and it was time to move on to another station, and then a different band would come into that station. Is that a fair representation you think there, Joe?
Yeah. Well, you take the industry, you know, from General Motors and Frigidaire Corporation and NCR, which was National Cash Register Corporation, all anchors in industry in the Dayton, Ohio area. You had steel and paper being made in Middletown, Ohio, just south of Dayton. And then Procter & Gamble and Ford and Fisher Body and all kinds of factories in the greater Cincinnati area. That Appalachian migration after World War II, that's what brought the Osborne brothers, mom and dad. Their dad got a job at NCR in Dayton in the early 40s. That brought that family to the area. Same thing. Red Allen left Pigeon Roost, Kentucky, and wound up working at NCR at the same factory where Bob and Sonny's dad worked. So you take the industrial strength brass title, you had Appalachian transplants that were putting in long, hard days in a factory or a sweatshop somewhere in my region of Ohio, but they had a banjo and a fiddle and a guitar underneath every bed at the house. And whether they played at honky tonks on Thursday and Friday and Saturday night or churches on Saturday night and Sunday mornings, they brought Appalachian music with them. And it was a booming metropolitan area with money and jobs, radio and television stations sprang up everywhere in this region. The radio station in Middletown, Ohio, WPFB, went on the air in 1947. And immediately they started promoting hillbilly music. They had a huge tent. The radio station was on an old farm. And they put up a tent next to the barn on this old farm. They had huge package shows there. Everybody from Monroe to Hank Williams and little Jimmy Dickens. And then they had local talent. And sometimes a troupe from Renfro Valley, Kentucky, where there was a great barn dance being established down there back in Appalachia on radio. And that's the first place where the Osborne brothers started performing in the late 40s as teenage kids, was in Middletown, Ohio. And it went on. Jimmy Martin wound up working there for a while. He came through the area with Monroe. He hooked up with Bobby Osborne. The first bluegrass recorded for King Records in Cincinnati, which King was huge in blues and race music in the and early country music in the 50s. The first bluegrass recorded on that major independent label was Bobby Osborne and Jimmy Martin in 1951. Jim and Jesse came to WPFB in Middletown for a while. Their first demos were recorded in that radio studio in Middletown. So what distinguishes Ohio Valley Bluegrass? Nobody makes better music than Homesick Hillbillies. And so you go to those folks that left those hills and hollers in Kentucky and West Virginia and East Tennessee that had to come up here to get a job. Man, they made great music. They made that homesick music, and I like it. I like it a lot.
That's kind of what happened up the road for me here in Baltimore. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and it was the same kind of deal. People went where the jobs were. They got homesick, and they had enough money that they could go out to beer joints at night and listen to people talk about how great it was back home where there was no work.
Yep. And that was a big part of it was making music that, you go to the history of guys like Buck Owens and Bob Wills. They had to make music people could dance to. Dance halls were what made Texas and honky tonk music in the 40s and 50s. You go to the Appalachian neighborhoods, and there are still neighborhoods in Dayton and Cincinnati that are predominantly Appalachian. You go to those neighborhoods back over the last 70 years, and there had to be a hillbilly band on stage that could make people want to drink beer. And man, that was the Osborne Brothers and Red Allen and Jimmy Martin. They could bring it. And I know Paul Williams is a dear friend who worked for a long time with Jimmy Martin. Paul wrote a lot of the Jimmy Martin and the Sunny Mountain Boys hits.
Yeah, he's real good.
Paul, many times he'd finish up a song and he'd sing Jimmy the first verse and chorus, and Jimmy would say, "Boy, that'll sell a lot of beer, Paul." That was one of the things they had to do, whether they were to honky tonk in Detroit or Dayton.
And I think that kind of is we're talking around it a little, but that's kind of sounds like it might be kind of the essence of that style of bluegrass, or the Baltimore style, which I think is very similar, and is that it's very definitely blue collar guys. These are the guys working in the factories. These are the guys who are not going to give up their day jobs. They may be great musicians, but you know they want to support their families. So there's this kind of hardcore quality to it, and it's sort of local quality. Like, they're not going to be touring nationally. They're going to be playing the music they know and love for the people who share their background in their neighborhood. And I think that it's kind of this intensity to it.
Well, there was a lot of that, but don't sell short the Bluegrass Hall of Famers from my area. Their goal all along was to sell a lot of records and get on the Grand Ole Opry. And the Osborne Brothers and Red Allen.
No, but yeah, I'm not selling them short by any means, but I think this is like part of what the scene in those areas kind of feeds off of.
Well, you wound up with a strong local scene here. When I was growing up here in the 70s and 80s, because of the music being in so many honky-tonks and American Legion halls and schoolhouses, in the 50s and 60s, it came on strong once bluegrass festivals hit, once bluegrass package shows could hit auditoriums and colleges. There was great bluegrass, whether it was regional, whether it was local bands that were writing and singing songs. The Allen Brothers, Red Sons, they were known somewhat nationally, but man, they played every honky-tonk in the Dayton area and every local bluegrass festival in the 70s when I was growing up. Harley and Greg and Ronnie and Neil Allen. So generationally, it stayed strong in the neighborhood, in the region, and had a huge impact nationally on bluegrass as far as where we are now because of some of those acts. And that's from whence I came. I grew up the son of homesick hillbillies who made music, whether it was at a neighborhood honky-tonk or at a church house, or eventually on bluegrass festival stages in the 70s and 80s.
Let me ask you a little bit more about radio. So we were talking about how important radio was in the early days of bluegrass, giving the bands a platform to play, spreading the sound out. But radio has changed a lot. I mean, for one thing, starting already in the 50s, television came up as a big competitor to radio. And then now in the present day, we have the internet and we have satellite radio that's kind of changing the landscape. How relevant do you think radio is today for bluegrass, and how do you think its role might have changed over the decades?
Well, it's changed dramatically. I started on radio full time as a teenager in 1982, and I've been on the radio most of the time since then. Got out off the air and worked a day job a few times in different arenas, but most of the time, and I bought my first local radio station in 1995, 25 years ago this month. And the changes are dramatic. When I bought my first radio station, there wasn't competition from satellite radio. There wasn't all kinds of podcasts and webcasts, and even then, you didn't even compete with all the gadgets in the dashboard of the vehicle. But it's changed dramatically. So to answer your question specifically, content is king. If you can deliver something on radio that they can't get anywhere else, whether it's personality driven, much of mine is personality driven, and then I'll hone in specifically on bluegrass and bluegrass gospel music for a couple hours each day. if that content is exclusive to your station, plus then if you're super serving your community. I own 3 local stations in 3 local counties in southwestern Ohio. They're all networked together. We dig deep and work hard to deliver information and entertainment that the local audience isn't getting anywhere else. We try to do it good enough that folks outside the area listen online. But we have to have a strong enough local audience that the local Ford dealer and Chevrolet dealer and insurance agent and furniture store, our name's got to come up in conversation or they drop their advertising. But we've been blessed to thrive with a huge roster of local and regional advertisers for the last quarter century. And so you've got to work and deliver quality content. And if you do it with bluegrass music, especially again, going the foundation which my career is built on in this region, yeah, we've got 3 generations of bluegrass fans that hear what I do on the radio. They are super loyal. They'll drive past 20 furniture stores to get to the one I did an ad for today because I play the kind of music they like. And that same loyalty from bluegrass listeners or from folks that endear themselves to my radio network. That's how I started my band. When I was growing up, my dad helped the boys from Indiana get started. They were a super popular bluegrass festival band in the 70s and 80s. And when Dad was on radio in the early 70s, if he got hired to promote some event at a car lot or a grocery store parking lot, he would say, I need that wild bunch of boys from Indiana to come over. We've got a show booked. We're going to play this Saturday at 2 o'clock at Howe Chevrolet in Middletown. And they could draw a whale of a crowd. Sort of the same thing. I've always been active in local and regional radio, and with my own radio network starting in 1995, to go out on location, just do a live remote broadcast and do pretty good at drawing a crowd or bringing attention to a local business. Dad and I, when he was still healthy, he was on radio with me from my local network here about the first 10 years. His health started failing in 05 and he retired, passed away in 08. But we would put together a few local pickers and go out and draw a crowd to an advertiser's location. By the spring of 06, Dad had to retire. I wanted to get a little more serious about, okay, whether it's a local advertiser of my radio network or a local community theater or county fair or a local festival, if they want to buy a package of promotion on my radio network and they need entertainment, I need to be able to provide that. I'd done that. If somebody called and they had a sizable budget, I'd booked and promoted concerts for everybody from Ricky Skaggs to Rhonda Vincent, right on down the bluegrass ladder. But maybe they called and they couldn't afford Rhonda Vincent or couldn't afford, Doyle Lawson. They could afford Joe Mullins and the Radio Ramblers, whether it was a local fair or festival or a car lot, someplace that my radio station had to have a crowd and pull in people and entertain folks. So the Radio Ramblers started in the spring of 06. First 2 or 3 years, mainly playing regional events that had to drive listeners from my radio stations to local areas. We developed a good vocal style and a nice set of material, put out a couple of albums. The second one was picked up by Rebel Records, and we had 2 albums come out in 2010 that were very well received. One was bluegrass, one was a gospel album. We went from playing regionally to playing nationally by 2011. We went to about 80 dates a year playing everywhere. We've maintained anywhere from 80 to 115 dates a year for the last decade.
Do you ever feature live bluegrass on your radio station?
Occasionally. Not set up for it now as conveniently as I was a few years ago. We had a bigger location, bigger studio previously than we've had the last dozen years. But every now and then, we'll throw something down live, whether it's just a duet in the studio. If it's Daly and Vincent stopping in to promote a record. I had the Quavy sisters on there. They're Western swing, not bluegrass.
Oh, they're great. Yeah.
We had them in studio live about a year ago, and every now and then something like that will happen. Or we'll do a live broadcast from someplace around the region. Oftentimes, maybe sometimes it'll go Facebook Live instead of live on the air, depending on what's going on.
Hang on a minute. I'm just typing something in the chat. about the Quebe sisters. It's kind of an unusual name, so I want to make sure that people see how it's spelled there.
Yeah.
And by checkle them out, I mean check them out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to type around this makeshift thing that I've put my camera on, but yeah. Anyway, well, where do you see? What do you see? Okay? Let me backtrack there. When you were a little kid, you were seeing, kind of that first generation. I guess your dad is what we would call a first and a half generation bluegrass player, but you were seeing, the old school bluegrass, and you still have, deep knowledge of that, and are friends with people from that world who are still with us. What do you see about the way the music is developing? I know from your activities in IBMA, you're very interested in the health of bluegrass as an industry. And that includes the whole spectrum of styles that have come under the heading of bluegrass. And you tend to be more on the traditional side, but how do you see that whole spectrum?
Well, I know what I'm capable of, traditional bluegrass. But that doesn't mean I'm not capable of finding a great song from some other genre and making it work for my band. We've done that all along. And I learned that from some of those first and second generation bluegrass artists. And some of that's still going on today in a great way. I just love the way the Country Gentlemen and the Seldom Seen and J.D. Crowe and the New South, they changed the whole landscape and broadened the genre, broadened the popularity and the following by broadening the base material. By the time bluegrass festivals hit in the mid and late 60s, by the time the big Appalachian migration had been pretty well fulfilled after World War II, we had to find different audiences. And we found them. We found them in Cincinnati and Dayton, and we found them in D.C. and Baltimore, and we found them in California. And those savvy bands that were such great talents that could push the boundaries by finding new material or new ways to do old material, like Boone Creek, all helped expand the genre. And that's all good. The expansion continued, with progressive bands in the 80s and 90s, your Newgrass revivals and so on and so forth. That's all good too. Sometimes I've said that bluegrass music is kind of like, it's like television was when I was a kid. You had 3 channels. And when I was back years ago, you had a half a dozen good bands that put out a record every year, and that was it. And it's continually grown and grown and grown and grown to where now you got a few hundred bands that put out a good record every year instead of just a few dozen. Same way, bluegrass music, it was kind of like ice cream. When I was a kid, you had 3 or 4 flavors. First time you saw Rocky Road or Butter Pecan, you kind of freaked out because it was usually just chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry.
So Billy Strings is like Ben and Jerry. Is that the deal there?
So now you go to a quality ice cream counter, you've got 50 flavors instead of a half a dozen that we had 40 years ago when I was a kid, and that's good. That's good. But matter of fact, I've used this analogy before because I advertise for a big dairy here locally that makes great ice cream in like 50 flavors. And coincidentally, Sunday was National Ice Cream Day, and I read a couple articles. No matter how many flavors we've got, vanilla is still the best seller. You go to bluegrass music, we got so many flavors. We got, Billy Strings and the Steeps. They've got hundreds of thousands of new followers for what they call or their fans call bluegrass music. Eventually, when you come back to the quality 3-chord music of the Stanleys or Flatt and Scruggs or Monroe or Reno and Smiley, you come back to the root of it all. And I'm not saying that music is more popular than Billy Strings is right now, but Flatt and Scruggs still sell a heck of a lot of records. And that's because vanilla is still the best flavor. Folks find their way back to it. Same thing happened when I was a kid in the 70s or the early 80s when, you know, you had this great new band, Doyle Lawson and Quicksilver. They're doing I'd Rather Die Young and Be Forgotten. You got all the kids in the parking lot saying, man, this Doyle Lawson's got a new song that's great. Well, no, sorry, it was a Stanley Brothers song 25 years earlier. That kind of stuff still happens. It still happens in a good way. I'm not saying we got to keep doing the same old songs. I've been very purposeful in how our band chooses material because we're very traditional, but I want to be relevant. And I didn't grow up in a cabin on a mountain. And I don't have memories of the old home place like that Appalachian migrant generation did. We don't do a lot of those songs. While we would love to do them in jam sessions. Everybody loves to crank down on the old home place or Blue Ridge Cabin Home. But my band does not choose to do those songs in our stage show or on our records because they're not who we are. We don't have the ability to deliver those with the sincerity. And those have been sold and resold and packaged and repackaged by great bands for the last 70 years. We need to find songs that are relevant to who we are and who our audience is. Same thing's happening with bands that have pushed the boundaries, and that's great.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting, you had that song, "Gotta Have Some Bacon in My Beans." Did I get that title right, or something like that? Right?
Bacon in my beans.
Yeah, and you know, I know a lot of people who heard that song and just saw it as just a knee-jerk reaction of everything that's changing in our culture. I saw it very differently, though. I saw it as a guy who recognizes he's got to make some changes in his life. Things are different from what they used to be, but he wants to retain what was good about the past. Maybe that's too much of a burden to dump on a lighthearted comic song, but that's the way I see it. It's about understanding what we like about the past and trying to maintain that as we move into the future. And I think that's always something that bluegrass has always been about.
That's a deep analogy. Now, I hadn't thought about that song in that exact context.
You just thought it was about bacon, right?
It applies to our conversation. Meaning, yeah, we're more educated. We know what's good to include in our diet, what's bad to include in our diet, but some things you can't mess with. And if somebody's a bacon lover, it doesn't mean that they still don't eat, you know, more fiber and they don't choose fruits and vegetables first. But some things you just can't mess with. And the old boy's got to have some bacon in his beans. I don't care what else you feed me, darling. I got to have bacon in my beans. and I'm the same way. I love, man, there's 2 or 3 of Billy Strings cuts I have wore out on the radio. But I will not stop playing Flatt and Scruggs, Reno and Smiley, and the Osborne Brothers just because we've got great new talent by those others. And it's just part of who we are. In bluegrass. And I do an hour on radio every weekday at 2 p.m. Eastern time called the Banjo Show. And it's 50-50 classic and current bluegrass. And I'll go from the Stanley Brothers right on up to something new by Alan Bobby and Grasstown. You know, during my segment of our radio day or our programming day, I don't get too far out on a limb as far as progressive bluegrass, but we have other programming that can do that. But again, current and classic, I combine the two. Because let's face it, folks, Monroe had a 70-year career. Stanley had a 70-year career. Right now, Del McCurry and Larry Sparks and Doyle Lawson are working on 70-year careers. There ain't too many genres where you can do that. Bluegrass and jazz and blues, we respect our elders. We know from whence we came. And you can go to an event and see the strongest new talent out there, like a Billy Strings, and still see a Del McCurry or a Larry Sparks. And audiences are going to love and respect both.
I'd like to ask you, of the really younger musicians coming up, I'm talking about the people who are 30 years old and younger, who just really grabs you? I'm not asking for the big picture, I'm just asking for your favorites.
Oh, I'm a huge High Fidelity fan.
Oh,
they are High Fidelity.
High Fidelity, check them out.
And they're great.
Jeremy is an amazing banjo player, he really is.
Kurt Stevens is an amazing banjo player. Kurt's doing most of the work on their recordings. And Jeremy, he'll play some. They do twin banjos better than anybody since Don Reno and Eddie Adcock.
Hang on a minute. I gotta put in a link here. I gotta find that one. They did that great version of Follow the Leader.
Yes, twin that sucker. They just released their new album is killer. It's got dueling banjos on it. Not that we got to keep playing something like that all the time, but they're instrumental and vocal prowess. Jeremy is just as good a singer as he is player.
Hold on. Sorry, I gotta hang on a minute. I had the sound going there. Didn't mean to do that.
High fidelity.
Yeah. Okay, so this
They're
is a link. This is a link to their video. Twin banjo. It's a twin banjo version of a tune that Don Reno recorded in the '60s, and is a guy who not only is a great player, but he also has good taste in vintage neckties, which I'm really into.
They're very into old school. Their choice of material, the way they arrange their songs, instrumentally, vocally, they're almost 100% a cover band, but they dig into the 40s and 50s and 60s hard. They got a very Reno Smiley, Jim and Jesse type attitude. I love what they do as a traditionalist. They're young traditionalists that really get it. I like Carolina Blue, great young traditional band.
Another good one, yeah.
Another good one.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Someone on the feed is asking where they can stream your radio stations. Would realrootsradio.com work, or?
Realrootsradio.com, or go to your app store on Android, iPhone, type in Real Roots Radio. You got an app for your smartphone or your tablet. Yeah, the station is not 100% bluegrass. We include bluegrass in a lot of what goes on all the time, but we also include Sturgill Simpson and Waylon Jennings and a lot of gritty American roots music. Weekdays 1 till 3, when I'm not on the road with the Radio Ramblers, which is rare right now, I do an hour called Hymns from the Hills at 1, which is gospel, and it's 80% bluegrass gospel. Then I do an hour called The Banjo Show at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And that's 50-50 classic and current bluegrass. Real Roots Radio, RealRoots Radio. RealRootsRadio.com is the website, and you can listen online or put the app on a smartphone or Android.
Sorry, I just posted an incorrect link accidentally.
Come on.
It's about time, 4 o'clock here, so I have a few closing announcements for you. Big thanks to Joe and Ira for leading this session.
Thanks so much, Joe, for being part of this. This is great.
Very grateful, and I think I sent a couple of banjo lessons in. Hopefully they worked and got posted, and folks are soaking up that content. You asked about bluegrass from my area, and I gave a pretty good backup lesson on some of the honky-tonk style banjo that Jimmy Martin and J.D. Crowe first developed, a lot of it in this neighborhood.
All right, thanks. Let me thank our sponsors again. The West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, the West Virginia Humanities Council in particular. I included a link in the chat feed for a feedback form so we could get more grant funding from them in the future. If you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't enjoy it, fill out a survey if you don't mind. It'll take about 3 minutes. And the National Endowment for the Arts, Davis and Elkins College, and all of you 32 contributors out there who made this program possible. Big thanks again to Joe. I'm going to ask you all to unmute so you can give a little round of applause if you'd like.
Thanks, everybody, for logging on.
Great, Joe. Stay safe, stay cool. I don't know if are you having the same kind of heat out there that we're having on the East Coast?
Yeah, we've been 90 every day for the whole month.
Oh
yeah,
my,
same here. Same here.
90. That's sad.
Yep.
I feel like I'm at a Bluegrass festival.
Baby Freya wants to say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And hey, I just want to remind you all, we have Bluegrass Happy Hour at 5, just to hang out and chat with each other if you all want. You're all welcome to that, and we'll see you again later in the week.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.